You know nothing, Jon Snow.
Got a theory, could be bunny. You never say thank you.
That's what the money is for!
Winter is coming.
The danger. I am the one who knocks.
I think
A
that
damn
I may
fine
be
cup of coffee.
the voice of my generation.
Suit up!
Bonjour et bienvenue dans PIC TV, le podcast qui analyse et décortique vos séries préférées. Je m'appelle Anaïs et cette semaine, on a un épisode un petit peu spécial à partager avec vous. Vous avez déjà eu l'occasion de nous écouter parler de la série For All Mankind, diffusée sur Apple TV+ depuis 2019. C'est une série uchronique créée par Matt Wolpert, Ben Nedivi et Ron Moore. Si son nom vous dit quelque chose, c'est parce que c'est le créateur de Battlestar Galactica et c'était aussi un des scénaristes de Star Trek. Donc gros pédigré. La série For All Mankind, elle, démarre dans les années 60 et imagine ce qu'il se serait passé si les soviétiques avaient été les premiers à marcher sur la Lune au lieu des Américains. Et j'ai eu récemment l'occasion de discuter avec les co-créateurs, Matt Wolpert et Ben Nedivi, et je voulais vous partager l'interview. On a parlé des influences de la série, des défis de l'écriture, puisque vous le savez, ils font énormément de bonds dans le temps et ils essaient toujours de coller à une certaine réalité historique, même si c'est une série qui invente beaucoup. On a aussi abordé certaines intrigues de la saison 4, qui est actuellement en cours de diffusion. Au moment où je leur ai parlé, je n'avais pu voir que les 7 premiers épisodes, mais si vous préférez ne pas être spoilé sur la saison 4, attendez un tout petit peu avant d'écouter cet épisode. Je vous laisse écouter notre interview en version originale et on se retrouve très bientôt pour plus de PIC TV. My first question is about your female characters. My co-host and I, we wrote a book about female anti-heroes on TV, and we mentioned your show because you have so many of them. And I was curious to know how you approach writing female characters without going to the cliché of the quote-unquote badass woman character.
There's a history in American television of being careful, like that when you write a woman character, a female character, they're a little more worried about, are they unlikable? Are they likable? It's something Matt and I stressed early on in the show. We wanted to treat the woman character as real humans, complex. They're good at things, they're bad at things, they go through things. So it shouldn't be a revolutionary idea, but strangely, in the world of television and movies, it is rare. And we wanted to make sure that our women were as complex, if not more, than our male characters. And I think that's one of the things we definitely continue to focus on.
Season 4 goes really deep into the upstairs-downstairs dynamic. Can you tell me why you wanted to go there?
It was really interesting to us to broaden out the type of people who get to go to space as the decades evolve and the space program evolves. It made sense to us that as they need different types of workers, as you're building out a colony on Mars, there would be different types of people with different sets of skills. So it wouldn't just be super pilots and brilliant scientists and engineers. It would be people that can build things and know how to mine things. And so as you kind of expand the world of who gets to go to space, it felt really interesting to us as you're also building a society. How do those different types of people live together in what's still a pretty confined space? You know, and you can't just like take a walk outside. Like it's very claustrophobic, even if it's much bigger than in season 3. For me, that was probably the most exciting part on a character level of season 4, was getting to tell a different type of story with different characters and how they interact with the people that have kind of populated our show to this point.
And the writer's strike in Hollywood was voted way after you had wrapped filming, I think, but it had been a long time coming. So was that at all present in the writer's room at the time of writing season 4?
No, and I have to say, it's one of those things that was very, the timing of that was odd. We started writing the show way before the show even starts shooting. So we were not aware at all that this would become the year of labor strikes. And definitely as it happened, we did start thinking people will think we are right. People who watch the show are like, oh, they're reacting to the strikes that are going on. But honestly, it was happenstance. And maybe a bit of it was in the air. I think the show strangely does have a tendency to kind of predict things that are going to happen. Like we wrote also this asteroid story in season 4, and on the day our trailer dropped, they did a mission to Psyche 16, to the asteroid. So it's interesting how I think a lot of what we tend to be ahead of the curve on certain things, and that's definitely one of them as well, where the timing actually ended up being fortuitous.
You've killed off some beloved characters on the show. How do you know when a character's time is up?
it's a couple different things, honestly. There are times where we feel, well, this character's arc is kind of coming to a close, and we don't necessarily feel that there's more story to tell with that character. But they're also, I think, the most tragic deaths are ones where there is more story to tell potentially, but the story in that moment has led us to make that decision.
How scary is it to kill a fan favorite?
It's very scary. I have to say, we go through our own mourning ourselves, like thinking about, because we fall in love not just with the characters, but with the actors playing the characters. So when we have to say goodbye, I feel like it's a double death in our life. But I think one of the things we've noticed is the harder it is on us, probably the harder it is on the audience as well. And so we've gone out of our way to make sure we're not just killing off characters that people don't like. In fact, I find ourselves sometimes killing off characters that are our favorites and the fan favorites. And I think for that reason, it's much more impactful.
What was the hardest character death for you on the show?
Can I just pause? I'm sorry. I got a dry spot in the back of my throat.
He's getting emotional. He's getting emotional.
I'm just remembering Gordo and Tracy, and I'm just gonna put the lozenge in. It'll take 1 second.
I'll answer while he recovers. I mean, they're all very hard. I hate to pick out one that's hardest. I think the one that stood out to us a little bit more was lately was Molly Cobb, Sonia Walger. I think that, was a character that we thought, our original plan, she was supposed to die in season 1. And she she was such a life force in the show that we noticed right away that we kept kind of building story for her. So by the time the death came in season 3, even though we felt like it was the right time and it was the perfect ending, it was very difficult at that moment. And, it is emotional. I find ourselves when we're with the actors, we're crying, but yeah, it's always difficult.
Yeah, I still get emotional thinking about that, so it was very well done. Are you ever tempted to keep them around, even though you know it might not be good for the show, but just because you love the actors or the characters and you can't really part with them?
Honestly, it's incredibly difficult because we grow close to these people as colleagues, as friends. Like we all reference our show as the fam. It's like, it feels like a family after this long. And so to have to say goodbye to those people is incredibly difficult. And also it's hard on a creative level to like say goodbye to those characters. But, when you feel compelled to tell that story, you kind of have to honor that.
And the nature of the show is, we always knew from the beginning that if we're going to do these jumps in time of a decade, we couldn't hold on to the original cast as much as we love them. For the idea to truly work, we would have to bring in new faces, new voices as the show continues. And if we're bringing new voices, then you need some faces to leave. And I think that was something we didn't want to do all at once. We wanted to be like a slow evolution. And that's why we introduced a character like Deva Yesa in season 3 and a character like Miles Dale in season 4. It's a slow bringing in new people as other people leave. I mean, that's always the idea. And in theory, when we came up with that originally, it was like, oh, this will be great. But yes, of course, once you get to know them, it becomes much more difficult and it's harder to stick to that plan.
Okay, so follow-up question. How long is Ed Baldwin going to be hanging out in space? Because he's pretty old now.
Well, it's zero gravity, so it's easier to get around.
150 years? What do you think?
Who knows how long it could, the less the gravity, maybe you just live really long time. I mean, it's an answer that is we're constantly asking when is the right time for any of our characters to leave the story or to move on from the story. And I think people just have to keep tuning in to find out.
We will. The concept of the show makes it seem like everything is pretty much possible, but is there something that you've decided that you will never do with the story?
I will say the show where we're getting now is getting to territory we've never gotten into before because, we are big history buffs. So I think up until season 4, a lot of the show was history and plans that NASA had and ideas that were being explored. And as we go into season 4, it did become a little more theoretical. And now the science starts to be a little sci-fi. And I think for us, it makes us a little uncomfortable because, yes, it's a science fiction show, but we pride ourselves on making it feel very grounded and realistic. So there are certain things, I think, whenever they come up that in the writer's room, where we say, that's too much. Like, let's try to hold on to what the tone of the show is which make the science feel as real as possible, even as we're pushing further into the future. So there are things, but I feel overall, as long as we make it feel real and grounded, we'll go for it.
So has that happened more? That's too much with season 4?
Oh, yeah.
It definitely has, but it's also interesting because we're getting into more theoretical science the further we go. And so there's a lot more discussion, even on the science side, about, well, is this possible or not possible? How far away would this be? What steps have to happen for this science to become possible? But then there is like just the laws of physics. And, Ben and I are in no way qualified to really make decisions about physics or math or anything like that. We rely on our advisors for that. And there have been a lot of times where we're like, we've got this great idea where this thing happens, and Garrett will just be like, that is literally not possible with the laws of physics. So we have to, that's a hard line. Like, physics has to track.
So everything that happens on season 4 is still theoretically possible.
Yes, and I have to say, almost everything on the show so far has been theoretically possible and continues to be, but it does get harder and harder as we go. It's funny, in the beginning, it used to be, oh yeah, this happened. Now our consultants, they argue with each other over things. Like, they're arguing with us, and now they're, no, it could be this, it could be this. So I think that's what we have to look forward to more.
Can you tell me maybe one thing that you really wanted to make happen on this show, but they were like, no, there's no way that's possible?
There's so many things.
I think the one thing that leaps to my mind is we initially had wanted Gordo and Tracy to have to go outside with nothing on. Like, can somebody go out in the vacuum of space with nothing on but their clothes on their back? And they're like, no, they would immediately die. But that led to an even better idea, which was the duct tape suit, which has become this kind of iconic thing. And that's what I think is really special about writers' rooms and the conversation we have with our consultants and advisors is like, just because the first idea isn't possible doesn't mean that's the best idea. In fact, the best ideas usually comes at the end of the discussion.
Do you think there's still room for shows like yours that have no big movie stars and that are built to go on for many, many seasons and that have an audience that keeps building over time? Because it feels like those types of shows are disappearing, but that's what I love about yours, is that it just keeps growing. It's not meant to be this one season concept. Do you think that could still happen?
I do. I feel the same as you, though. I worry for that, because I think more and more TV seems to be going like the way movies went, where you need stars to open it. You need a big opening. And we have been TV long enough to also appreciate the show that, the show makes stars. You put actors in there and let the ensemble be a true ensemble. And I think it's one of the things we really love about our show. To your point, is we have a group of actors. Some are more familiar than others. They really can fall into the show, and you can really fall into the characters in a way where you're not saying, oh, that's the guy from that, and there's the girl from that. I'm hopeful that television will continue to do that. I think the kind of television we've seen the last 10 years has been incredible. And I know there's a lot of concern right now that that's going away. But I still believe once you open that up, it's going to be hard to put it back in the can. Like, I think those kinds of shows will continue to be made. And at least we're going to continue to make them. So
yeah, I like that yours is successful because it shows that you can still do it this way. I think that's a good sign.
Yeah.
We're huge fans of the Americans on the podcast, and I personally think a lot about it when I watch your show. How big of an influence has it been, and is it on your show?
It's definitely an influence. I mean, we're, in addition to being big fans of science fiction and space travel, we're also huge fans of the sort of espionage storytelling world, and the Americans did that incredibly well. We also talk about like movies like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and things like that are just really subtle, grounded. And I think one of the really cool things about our show is we're able to tell different types of stories within the world of our show. It's not always about the rocket launch. The Margot and Sergei storyline is really fascinating on this whole other level. In addition to the engineering and the politics of it, there is that espionage element that brings this other level to the show and lets us tell different types of stories within this broader world. So, and the other great thing about the Americans is Like they cast it so well.
Yeah.
And we're like working our way through all of the Americans, Russian actors.
Which, by the way, was not on purpose.
Right.
I think it became a thing where slowly we found ourselves, they're in the Americans. So yeah, hats off to their casting directors because they did a fantastic job and we're definitely taking advantage of it.
There's also the actor that played Adam on Mad Men. And I love just seeing those actors pop up in your show because they all feel like they're part of the same DNA in a way.
Yeah,
totally.
Definitely.
We were talking earlier about sort of old school TV, and there are some tropes that we really love, like sexual or romantic tension. How do you guys feel about those tropes, and do you try to use them or deconstruct them?
Yeah, it's a really interesting balance because, like, on one hand, there are things that work really well on a basic storytelling level, like romantic tension or conflict or friendship, and kind of tracking those things through. But we're also very conscious of expectations and not following what people expect. So we might seem like we're starting to tell a romantic tension story and then decide to go in a different direction just because we never want to feel like we're doing that thing that you've seen before.
Yeah. Do you have those conversations in the room where you're like, oh, this is veering into cliche, we need to do the opposite?
All the time.
Yeah, it's actually early on, one of the insults in our room was like, if someone had an idea, you're like, oh, that feels very TV or that feels very done. So we are constantly challenging ourselves, sometimes exhaustively, to make sure something feels new and different. And I think, it's sort of that Ellen Deek scene at the end of season 1 when she comes out to him. I think a traditional show probably would have said, well, this is the moment where he's supposed to embrace her, right? And I think for us, we kept feeling it's not right to his character. As much as we want that moment personally, and we wanted it for her, it didn't feel right for him. So I think by going the other way, it also fights the expectation of what you think that scene will be.
You're famously not afraid of huge time lapses and burning through plots. How do you decide the amount of time that you spend on a plot? Because in season 4, for instance, when Dev takes back Helios, that could have been a season arc, but it took 20 minutes instead. So how do you decide?
It's really at the beginning of the season, we take, in terms of breaking the story, we take a few weeks just to kind of figure out what the story of the whole season is going to be in kind of a beginning, middle, and end, and the characters' arcs. And in that part of the process, we wrap our minds around, well, how fast do we need to move through time? Because season 1 moved through multiple years in the season, and like season 2 was a few months. And because the story felt like that's how it needed to unfold in a more sequential way. So it's really determined by that first conversation and how we figure out what the heart of the story is. So like something like your reference might not, it was important, but it wasn't what the story really was about overall.
Do you ever have any regrets about going quote unquote too fast on some plot points?
We're writers. We only have regrets. So many regrets. That's why we have an alt history, so we can go back and change history. No, we do. I think there are definitely moments and times like, oh, I would have loved to tell that story. I would have loved to see that scene. I would have loved to see that moment of her getting that opportunity. But I think, like you said, the nature of the show, the real selling point of the show is that we want to show history as it's being made. We didn't jump ahead to like an alternate future where the Nazis had won. We decided intentionally we want to show how history changes. And the only way to do it is to do those jumps. And I have to say, sometimes for writers, having those creative limitations and challenges is good. Something writers sometimes fall into is preciousness. You get too precious about a character or a story. I want to show everything, and I think by fighting that instinct and pushing back and saying, a lot of times we'll talk out a lot of those storylines, and then someone in the room will say, yeah, or we can just jump to Dev coming into the room and taking, and you go and you think about it, you go, yeah, do we really need to show all of that? Are we missing any of the drama? And so I think a lot of times it's not that we decide we're going to jump in time a lot. I don't think that's the intention. I think the intention more is, what are the stories that are important to tell to the audience? What is important from a character perspective dramatically as you go? I think it's the characters who lead us, not the plot.
Has it ever helped you to solve story issues, to just be like, okay, let's jump ahead so that we don't have to worry about that whole story?
Yeah, we would never do
No.
that. It does help sometimes to skip over something that might if we saw it be a little too melodramatic or a little too, we can kind of pick and choose which emotional moments we want to see that fit within the tone of our show. So it's definitely a useful tool in our writing of the show, but it's something that's also, looking back on when we were first coming up with this idea, it felt like such a great, wow, we could just jump a decade every season. It's like so cool. And it really is also very difficult to just keep track of everything and to build all the new sets and have to put prosthetics on all our actors as on these beautiful actors. And we're like, no, we want to make you look really old. So it's a double-edged sword for sure.
The workers' crew scenes in season 4 reminded me a lot of Battlestar Galactica. Was it a bigger influence on this season than the previous ones?
We hate Battlestar Galactica. So
I've never heard of that show. What is that show?
What is that? It's funny. Now that you mention it, I see the similarity, but it wasn't intentional at all. In fact, I think, if anything, we probably try to stay away from doing anything for Battlestar or Star Trek, because Ron, our partner, obviously has a history there. And he also doesn't love to repeat himself. He loves to try new things. I think that's something we all embraced here. So I think really the similarities that on our show, space travel is becoming more routine, more common. So things like that make sense, because now the evolution of workers coming up there is a natural evolution of, this new colony and the need for labor. And where labor going up will lead to labor problems potentially when they realize they're being, exploited. So I think the stories came naturally, but I'm not surprised sometimes it repeats other sci-fi, just because we are getting, as I said earlier, to a place in the show where it is more science fiction.
My last question is kind of a big one, but after the past few months of the strike, I was curious, what is your outlook on the future of TV?
I still feel hopeful in spite of everything. I think there tends to be a tendency in Hollywood and of this, if everyone thinks a certain way, well, it's definitely going to be that way. And what I've learned working in this for 20 years is, nobody knows anything. And the reality is that I think once you open this can of television, that at this point, I feel like has reached the artistic level of cinema in many ways. It's starting to. And once you start to go down this path of being able to tell these amazing stories over years and seasons, it's going to be very hard to then say, okay, we're stopping that. Maybe I'm being too optimistic and naive, but I think it'll probably slow down in the near term, probably the next year or two. But I think eventually the hunger and the appetite in the world is there for this kind of content. And I think what I'm very excited about too is that it's not just American content. I think it's like building the content from all over the world and making it more international. I think allows us and allows filmmakers from all over the world to make more of these kinds of shows. So yeah, I'm hopeful that in the long term, it will continue.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad I got a chance to talk to you, and good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
Yeah, good questions.
C'était PIC TV. Merci les Piquistes de nous écouter encore et toujours. Vous pouvez retrouver tous les épisodes de PIC TV sur Slate Audio ou sur votre appli de podcast préféré. En ce moment, vous pouvez aussi retrouver Marie et moi dans notre autre podcast Amis, où l'on se fait découvrir certains de nos navets préférés. N'oubliez pas de vous abonner si ce n'est pas déjà fait. En attendant, si vous avez aimé ce podcast, parlez-en autour de vous et n'hésitez pas à nous mettre 5 étoiles et un petit commentaire. À très vite. PIC TV est un podcast d'Anaïs Bordage et Marie Telling, produit par Slate Podcast, direction éditoriale Christophe Caron, production éditoriale, prise de son et réalisation Aurélie Rodriguez.